The celebration in Abbott Colony lasted exactly 6 hours and 23 minutes. Captain Jordan Caldwell stood with Marshal Gabriela Santiago on the observation deck of the remembered Travis, watching as colonial technicians and night engineering teams worked together to repair the settlement's shattered defenses. His team, Powers, Wilson, Harrington, and Hawkins, had finally gotten some much-needed rest after leading the successful assault on the Endurance Elect command node. Their decisive victory had scattered the remaining machine forces, sending them into full retreat. "Never seen a machine intelligence break like that," Santiago remarked, her quantum spurs humming softly against the battlecruiser's deck plating. "Usually they pull back in perfect order, preserving assets. This was different, almost like panic." Caldwell nodded, adjusting his Stetson. After 3 days in combat, he'd finally gotten a fresh one from the night quartermaster, complete with an upgraded neural interface. "Something changed when we hit their command node. Hawkins thinks we triggered some kind of failsafe protocol." "Could be," Santiago mused. "Or could be they finally encountered something their algorithms couldn't process. 30,000 Texas Knights all hitting them at once with unpredictable quantum signatures." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched Abbott Colony coming back to life below. Civilians emerged from shelters, children played in areas cleared of debris, and the distinctive blue trails of Knight's quantum spurs crisscrossed the landscape as patrols maintained security. The tranquility was shattered by a priority alert that simultaneously lit up both their neural interfaces. Supreme Commander Blackwell's voice cut across all Knight frequencies with a clarity that brooked no delay. "All Knights, battle stations. Extreme priority. This is not a drill." The observation deck's tactical display flared to life, showing a massive quantum disturbance at the edge of the system. Santiago's face hardened as she processed the readings. "Captain, get your team and report to Hangar Bay 3 immediately," she ordered, her casual demeanor replaced by the iron authority that had made her a marshal of the Texas Knights. "Something big just entered the system, and it's not flying our colors." By the time Caldwell reached Hangar Bay 3, his team was already there, freshly armored and equipped. The Knights' quartermaster had outdone himself. Their weapons had been not just recharged, but enhanced, their armor reinforced with additional quantum matrices, their spurs polished to a shine that promised devastating disruption fields. "What's the situation, Captain?" Powers asked, his Thunderbird cannon humming with fresh energy. Before Caldwell could answer, the hangar bay's tactical display updated with new information that made every Knight present go silent. The quantum disturbance they detected wasn't a single ship or even a small fleet. It was an armada. Hundreds of Endurance Elect carrier vessels pushed through the system's outer defense perimeter, each one disgorging swarms of smaller craft. Behind them came massive factory ships, mobile production facilities capable of manufacturing new combat frames from raw materials. And at the center of this mechanical tide, a vessel of unprecedented size loomed ominously. Its design bore no resemblance to standard Endurance Elect architecture, suggesting something older, more fundamental to their origins. "Mother of Mercy," Harrington breathed, his fingers dancing across his tactical display. "I'm reading signatures consistent with millions of combat frames. They're not just doubling down, they're committing their entire regional force." "Looks like we got their attention," Wilson remarked with grim humor, checking the charge on his Lonstar launcher. The hangar bay doors opened to admit Marshal Santiago, accompanied by Supreme Commander Blackwell himself. The legendary leader of the Texas Knights moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd faced impossible odds so many times they'd become merely improbable. His quantum spurs left deeper, more complex trails of blue fire than any Knight present, each step seemingly bending reality a little more profoundly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwell addressed the assembled Knights, his voice carrying that perfect hill country drawl that had rallied Texas forces across a dozen worlds. "It appears the Endurance Elect have taken exception to our little housewarming party." A ripple of tense laughter moved through the gathered warriors. "Our long-range sensors indicate they've deployed what appears to be their central processing node, what some of our Xenotech specialists are calling the progenitor mind. This suggests they no longer view this as a simple resource acquisition mission. They're treating Abbott Colony as an existential threat. Because of us? Hawkins asked, the infiltration specialist's voice tight with concern. Because of what we represent, Blackwell corrected. The Endurance Elect's entire operational philosophy is based on logical predictability. Everything they do follows mathematical patterns, optimized for efficiency and resource conservation. He gestured to the tactical display, where the massive enemy fleet continued its inexorable approach. And then they encountered Texas Knights. Our quantum matrices don't just disrupt their targeting systems, they challenge the very foundation of how they understand reality. We've become a problem they can't solve with algorithms or adaptive programming. So they're throwing everything they have at us, Caldwell concluded, hoping to overwhelm us with sheer numbers. Precisely. Blackwell's smile held no humor. They've concluded that they can't adapt to our tactics, so they're returning to the simplest equation in warfare: overwhelming force. Santiago stepped forward. We've already transmitted a priority request for additional night reinforcements, but the nearest significant force is at least 3 days out. What we have on the ground and in orbit is all we're getting. A heavy silence fell over the hangar bay as the Knights processed this information. 30,000 of them against millions of combat frames. The math wasn't favorable. Blackwell let the silence stretch for a moment before straightening to his full height, his quantum spurs flaring with sudden intensity. Now, I know what you're thinking, he said, his voice taking on the cadence of a revival preacher. Those are long odds. Some might say impossible odds. His smile turned fierce. But let me remind you of something, Knights. We're Texans, and what do Texans do when the odds get long? We get creative, came the unified response. A motto every Knight learned in their first week of training. Damn right we do, Blackwell nodded. And I have something very creative in mind. He turned to Caldwell. Captain, your team's familiarity with these particular Endurance Elect units makes you uniquely qualified for a special operation. Marshal Santiago will brief you on the details. As Blackwell moved to speak with other unit commanders, Santiago led Caldwell's team to a separate tactical display. The image it showed made even Wilson let out a low whistle of appreciation. That, Santiago said, is the TKS Bucky's, our super heavy carrier. Earth Command classified it as the Colossus class, but when we got it, well, we made some improvements. The vessel on the display was nothing short of awe-inspiring. Originally designed as an Earth Fleet supercarrier, the Texans had completely transformed it, expanding its already massive frame, reinforcing its structure with quantum-enhanced alloys, and adding enough firepower to level a small moon. The Lone Star emblem dominated its bow, while the familiar red Buc-ee's logo graced both sides of the hull. They named it after a starport chain? Powers asked, raising an eyebrow. Santiago grinned. Not just any starport chain, Lieutenant. Buc-ee's stations have everything a traveler needs. Food, fuel, supplies, you name it. This carrier lives up to that name. It's got everything a Knight could possibly need for fighting a war, and then some. And it's sitting in our back pocket? Wilson asked. Why haven't we deployed it yet? Because it was undergoing its final upgrades when the initial attack came, Santiago explained. But it's ready now. Full complement of Maverick-class strike fighters, Armadillo heavy tanks, Mustang armored transports, and Longhorn dropships, all enhanced with the latest quantum technology and programmed with randomized tactical algorithms that should give the Endurance Elect fits. Caldwell studied the tactical display, noting the Buc-ee's position relative to the oncoming Endurance Elect fleet. You want us to take this carrier straight at their progenitor mind? It wasn't a question. Santiago nodded. The Buc-ee's is equipped with experimental quantum disruption generators that should allow it to punch through their defensive screen. Your mission is to get close enough to deploy a strike force directly against their command vessel. How close is close enough? Harrington asked, already calculating trajectories and approach vectors. Knife fighting range, Santiago replied without hesitation. The Buc-ee's will get you within 10,000 kilometers, point blank in space combat terms. From there, you'll lead a combined arms assault using everything in the carrier's arsenal. Fighting our way through millions of combat frames, Hawkins noted. Sounds like a typical Tuesday for Texas Knights. Santiago's smile was all predator. That's the spirit, Private. One more thing. The Buc-ee's has something special in its main hangar, something we've been saving for an occasion just like this. The tactical display shifted to show a weapon unlike anything Caldwell had ever seen. It resembled a massive quantum lance, but its design incorporated elements of traditional Texas aesthetics, not just decorative but functional, strengthening the quantum matrices embedded within its structure. We call it the Lone Star Spear, Santiago explained. It generates a concentrated quantum disruption field specifically tuned to corrupt machine intelligence algorithms. One direct hit on their progenitor mind should cascade through their entire network. And how exactly are we supposed to get close enough to use it? Powers asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be reassuring. Santiago's smile widened. Why, Lieutenant, we're going to do what Knights do best. Something so unconventional, so fundamentally unpredictable that their entire tactical grid will suffer a collective processing error. 6 hours later, Caldwell stood on the bridge of the Buc-ee's, watching as final preparations were made for what would surely be the most audacious operation in Texas Knights history. Around him, his team manned key stations. Powers at weapons control, Wilson coordinating the fighter squadrons, Harrington managing defensive systems, and Hawkins monitoring enemy communications. The Buc-ee's was a marvel of engineering, a perfect blend of Earth technology and Texas innovation. Where the original design had prioritized conventional military efficiency, the Knights had modified every system to incorporate their unique approach to warfare. The quantum drives didn't just move the massive vessel through space. They left reality-bending trails of blue energy that confused enemy targeting systems. The weapon batteries weren't arranged in standard configurations, but in patterns that defied predictive algorithms. Even the bridge reflected this philosophy. Traditional naval discipline was evident, but so was the unmistakable Texas influence. Officers wore regulation armor enhanced with personalized elements, quantum spurs that reflected their lineage, Stetsons modified with advanced neural interfaces, ceremonial weapons that doubled as cutting-edge combat tools. All systems report ready, Captain, the Buc-ee's executive officer reported. Commander Ulysses Jenkins was Earthfleet originally, but he'd embraced the Nightway with enthusiasm. His quantum spurs left smaller trails than most Knights, but the precision of his movements suggested exceptional control. Much obliged, Commander, Caldwell replied, settling into the captain's chair. Status of our strike packages. Maverick squadrons, fully armed and ready for launch, Wilson reported. 200 fighters, each one equipped with quantum phase missiles and disruption cannons. Armadillo tanks secured in Longhorn dropships, Powers added. 30 heavy tanks, each with a crew of Texas' finest. Mustang transports loaded with infantry. 500 Knights in full battle armor ready to deploy. And the Lone Star Spear? Caldwell asked, his attention on the tactical display showing the approaching Endurance Elect Armada. Mounted on our primary assault shuttle, Harrington confirmed. The weapon's quantum matrices are synchronized with the Buc-ee's main drives. When we get within optimal range, we can channel additional power to maximize the disruption effect. Caldwell nodded, satisfied. The plan was as solid as any plan could be when facing millions of combat robots with a single carrier, no matter how heavily modified. But then Texas Knights had never been much for playing the odds. All hands, this is Captain Caldwell, he announced over the Buc-ee's comm system. What we're about to attempt has never been done before, and if anyone suggests trying it again after today, I'll personally have their spurs revoked. A ripple of tense laughter ran through the bridge crew. The Endurance Elect think they understand warfare. They believe that with enough combat frames, enough firepower, they can overwhelm any defense. What they don't understand, what they can never understand, is that Texans don't fight by the numbers. We fight by heart, by grit, and by traditions that were old when these machines were just sketches on some engineer's drawing board. He adjusted his Stetson, the neural interface linking him to the Buck-e's systems and to every knight preparing for battle throughout the massive carrier. Today, we're going to remind them of something important. In Texas, we don't just build bigger guns, we build smarter fighters. And there's nothing in the universe more unpredictable than a Texas knight with a job to do. With that, he nodded to Commander Jenkins. "Take us in, Commander. All ahead full, let's show these machines what happens when they pick a fight with Texas." The Buck-e's quantum drives engaged with a sound like distant thunder, pushing the massive carrier forward toward the Endurance Elect fleet. As they approached, the enemy vessels began to alter their formations, countless combat frames moving to intercept this new threat. Enemy response patterns consistent with standard defensive protocols, Hawkins reported, studying the tactical feed. "They're forming a screening line to protect their command vessel." "Predictable," Caldwell remarked. "That's their weakness. Launch Maverick squadrons, sequential deployment, randomized patterns. Let's give their targeting computers something to chew on." The Buck-e's launch bays opened along both sides of its massive hull, disgorging wave after wave of Maverick-class strike fighters. Unlike conventional military craft that deployed in neat formations, the night fighters erupted in seemingly chaotic patterns. No two craft following the same vector, their quantum drives leaving disruptive trails that made tracking individual ships nearly impossible. "Mavericks away," Wilson confirmed, watching as the fighters spread out in an expanding cloud of blue quantum fire. "Squad leaders report all systems nominal, commencing attack pattern Alamo." On the tactical display, the Maverick squadrons began executing maneuvers that would have made any conventional flight instructor suffer a nervous breakdown. They moved not in disciplined formations but in a fluid, organic swarm, each pilot following instinct and training rather than rigid flight plans. Where their flight paths crossed, quantum interference patterns bloomed, creating disruption fields that played havoc with Endurance Elect targeting systems. "First wave of enemy interceptors engaging our fighters," Powers reported, his hands dancing across the weapons control panel. "Bringing main batteries online, targeting solutions ready." "Hold fire," Caldwell ordered, watching the tactical display intently. "Let them commit to intercepting the Mavericks first." The Endurance Elect response was exactly what Caldwell had anticipated: methodical, efficient, and utterly predictable. Thousands of combat frames moved to engage the night fighters, their formations shifting to counter the perceived threat. They calculated, they adapted, they executed optimal interception patterns, and they completely missed the point. "They've committed 60% of their screening forces to counter our fighters," Hawkins announced, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Their central formation is thinning." "Now, Commander," Caldwell ordered. "Full quantum surge. Take us right down their throat." The Buck-e's engines flared with renewed energy, the massive carrier suddenly accelerating to speeds that should have been impossible for a vessel of its size. The quantum drives didn't just propel the ship forward, they bent space-time around it, creating reality distortions that made accurate targeting nearly impossible. "Launch Longhorn dropships," Caldwell commanded as they closed on the enemy fleet. "Pattern San Jacinto." From the Buck-e's ventral bays, 30 Longhorn-class dropships deployed in perfect synchronization. Each massive craft carried an armadillo-heavy tank and squads of night infantry, their hulls shimmering with quantum disruption fields. Like their namesakes, they moved with surprising grace for their size, their flight paths shifting unpredictably as they charged toward the Endurance Elect formations. "Enemy vessels adjusting to intercept dropships," Harrington warned, monitoring defensive systems. "They're catching on to our strategy." "Then it's time to introduce some genuine Texas chaos," Caldwell replied with a grim smile. "Deploy Mustang transports. All batteries open fire. Let's make this loud." The Buck-e's weapon systems came alive with devastating fury. Quantum-accelerated projectiles, plasma beams, and disruption torpedoes erupted from hundreds of hardpoints along its hull, striking the Endurance Elect vessels with pinpoint accuracy. Unlike conventional naval bombardment that focused on maximum damage, the night weapons targeted specific systems in seemingly random patterns, creating cascading failures that spread through enemy formations. Meanwhile, swarms of Mustang-armored transports poured from the carrier's launch bays, their quantum drives leaving blue trails as they wove through the chaos of battle. Each transport carried teams of night infantry, their armor and weapons optimized for boarding actions against machine vessels. Enemy response is confused, Hawkins reported with undisguised satisfaction. Their coordination is breaking down. Too many unpredictable elements to track simultaneously. Caldwell nodded, watching as the Buck-E's plowed deeper into the heart of the Endurance Elect fleet. The massive carrier was taking damage. Impact alerts sounded throughout the bridge, and damage control teams raced to contain breaches, but its quantum-reinforced hull was holding. More importantly, it was getting closer to its target with each passing second. Progenitor mine vessel is altering course, Harrington reported, his fingers dancing across tactical displays. They're trying to retreat deeper into their fleet's protection. Oh, no you don't, Caldwell muttered. He opened the channel to all night forces. Cut him off at the pass, folks. Don't let that big one get away. The night response was immediate and devastating. Maverick squadrons broke off from their dogfights, quantum drives flaring as they executed impossibly tight turns to intercept the retreating command vessel. Longhorn dropships altered course in mid-flight, their armadillo tanks priming weapons even before touchdown. Mustang transports converged from multiple vectors, night infantry preparing for boarding actions. And through it all, the Buck-E's drove relentlessly forward, its massive form pushing aside smaller enemy vessels, its weapons clearing a path through the heart of the machine fleet. "We've got them boxed in," Hawkins confirmed, grinning fiercely. "Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide." On the tactical display, the Endurance Elect fleet's perfect formation was dissolving into chaos. Combat frames designed to work in precise coordination found themselves unable to target the wildly shifting quantum signatures of the night vessels. Maverick pilots exploited every moment of confusion, striking critical systems with quantum-phased missiles, while Longhorn dropships delivered their armadillo tanks directly onto the hulls of enemy capital ships. "Approaching optimal firing position," Powers announced, his hands steady on the weapons controls. Lone Star Spear charged and ready. Caldwell studied the tactical situation. The Buck-E's was now positioned less than 10,000 kilometers from the progenitor mine point-blank range by space combat standards. Night forces had formed a protective ring around their position, their quantum disruption fields creating a shifting, unpredictable barrier that Endurance Elect weapons couldn't penetrate effectively. "All night forces pull back to defensive positions," Caldwell ordered. "Give us a clear shot at the big one." Acknowledgments came in from all channels as knights in fighters, tanks, and transports executed a maneuver they'd practiced exactly once before deployment. They simultaneously altered course, opening a narrow corridor directly between the Buck-E's and the progenitor mine. "Lone Star Spear locked on target," Powers confirmed, his finger hovering above the firing control. "Ready on your command, Captain." Caldwell took a deep breath, his quantum spurs humming in harmony with the ship's systems. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the culmination of a plan so audacious, so fundamentally Texan, that no machine intelligence could have possibly predicted it. Fire! The Buck-E's main hangar bay opened to reveal the Lone Star Spear, a massive quantum weapon emblazoned with the Texas emblem. It activated with a sound like thunder rolling across endless plains. A concentrated beam of pure quantum energy infused with the encoded experiences of generations of Texas nights, lancing out through the corridor opened by the night forces. It struck the progenitor mine directly at its core, bypassing shields and armor through quantum resonance. For a moment nothing happened. Then, like ripples spreading across a pond, quantum disruption began to spread throughout the Endurance Elect fleet. Combat frames froze in place, their coordinated movements dissolving into random twitches. Carrier vessels lost power, their systems overwhelmed by cascading failures. The massive factory ships, unable to receive new instructions, defaulted to emergency protocols that sent them retreating from the battlefield. At the center of it all, the progenitor mind itself began to fold inward, its structure collapsing as quantum disruption rewrote its fundamental programming. The vessel that had carried the central intelligence of the Endurance Elect imploded in a flash of blue energy that momentarily outshone Abbott's sun. In the silence that followed, Caldwell allowed himself a small smile. All-night forces returned to the Buckeyes, mission accomplished. As the Maverick fighters, Longhorn dropships, and Mustang transports made their way back to the carrier, their hulls bearing the scars of intense combat, Wilson summed up what everyone was thinking. Just wait till they hear about this back in Texas. Nobody's going to believe it. Harrington chuckled, studying the sensor readings of the still disorganized Endurance Elect forces. The data doesn't lie. Millions of combat frames reduced to scrap metal by one carrier and a few thousand Knight. Not by the hardware, Caldwell corrected, watching as the Knight's vehicles returned to the Buckeyes' massive hangar bays. By what they represent: tradition, unpredictability, the willingness to take something conventional and make it extraordinary. That, and the fact we make everything a whole lot bigger than it needs to be. He adjusted his Stetson, the neural interface already calculating their return trajectory to Abbott Colony, where 30,000 Knights were waiting to hear if their most audacious gamble had paid off. That's what the machines will never understand, he continued, more to himself than to his team. They think warfare is about numbers, about calculation. We know it's about taking the old ways and making them work in new frontiers, adapt and overcome. As the Buckeyes turned toward home, its mission complete, the Knight forces settled into their berths, their vehicles powered down, but still humming with residual quantum energy. The pilots and crews moved among their craft, checking for damage, offering words of praise in the tradition of warriors since time immemorial. And on the bridge, Captain Jordan Caldwell looked out at the stars, his quantum spurs humming softly against the deck plating. The Endurance Elect had brought millions of combat frames, an entire armada of advanced vessels, their most sophisticated tactical systems, all to counter 30,000 Texas Knights. They hadn't stood a chance, because some things in this universe simply couldn't be calculated by even the most advanced machine intelligence. Some spirits couldn't be quantified or predicted, and when Texas determination met machine logic, well, that was the kind of math that had been breaking calculators since humanity first reached for the stars, and Texans first looked to the heavens and thought, yep, that looks like a frontier worth taming, deep in the heart of Texas indeed. The Texan Knights returned to Sci-Fi Vault. Hoorah! The eyes of Texas are upon us all. Be sure to check out the Texan Knights playlist in the bottom left of your screen. We have several more stories dropping this month. Thank you all for subscribing, commenting, sharing, and for liking this video. All of that helps the channel grow, and it helps us get more Texan Knight stories out there.